And we're live. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the Rational Standard podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Woode-Smith, and I am joined by my friends, Ayanda, Zulu, Zakhele, Mthembu. And we're here for a very, important, with every episode's important. Now, the news today is not what we're going to be discussing because it's kind of confusing and the dust hasn't settled yet. But I think that it warrants a mention that the Pala Pala ruling has basically been found unconstitutional and that there's a chance that Ramaphosa might be impeached. So President Cyril Ramaphosa might be impeached. I need to be respectful here until he's impeached. That is something that we are likely to discuss next week because we don't want to just surmise things here and give you a whole nothing burger. So instead, we're going to be discussing two other major news items from this week. The first, which is the legal challenges against Black economic empowerment amendments, which are meant to be affecting the legal sector. Now, for context, this week and in the previous weeks, the major major law firms of Weber Wenzel, Workmans, Bowmans, and Denny's, with help from Solidarity, have been taking the government to court to oppose a gazetted legal sector code, which was introduced in September 2024, which sets out BE targets where 50% of the ownership of a legal law firm must be Black, with 25% of it being Black ownership, Black women. Now, this is in corporate sector, this is par for the course. We know about this. We know that how BE has obscured a lot of ownership and economic growth incentives in corporate space. Now, finally, the legal industry is coming under fire, and they are not happy, especially because they're saying that you can't really apply these types of quotas to the legal sector because a lot of law firms are not really, like, the ownership isn't traditional, like, oh, you have a board, you have executives, things like that. A lot of the time you'll have maybe two partners, like two lawyers who are in charge of this firm and they've got people underneath them. And they also say that it's not something where you can just give ownership of to someone. They have to be mentored, they have to go through a process, and it's almost like some sort of brotherhood rather than some sort of corporate space. Now, they say they believe in transformation. They say they support transformation. They just don't think it's applicable to the legal sector, which kind of makes me think, they're being kind of hypocritical here. And when I was reading through their challenges to be the legal sector code, I was thinking, like, hey, all these things you're mentioning, that, oh no, you need to train this person properly, you can't just hand over ownership of this firm to someone else, it's about like rising to ranks organically and stuff like that. Doesn't that apply to all businesses? That's my thought. Ayanda, what are your thoughts on this?
Hi, Nicholas, and then hi to Zex and to our listeners today, well, our audience rather, not listeners. I think our friend Zex will be able to give us, a more informed opinion on this, given that he's the legal scholar in the room. So I'm waiting for him. But I think I've also been following, the news cycle over the past few days. I've read a few articles here and there, and I think what you have said already, Nicholas, provides some very important context. The other thing I think I heard, which was, of course, mentioned by the law firms involved who are driving this case, is that the provisions of this gazette are impractical. They are unworkable because you're being given basically this 50% sort of target, and I think it's over a period of 5 years, if I'm not wrong. So ownership has to increase by 10% literally every year. And one of the points they've raised is that this is simply unworkable in practice. Procedurally, it is unworkable. So I do think that's an important point. But more broadly, because this touches on questions of what you can call race law and so forth and affirmative action, I think there is, of course, a principled position that one can take on that. Even though you can engage with a discursive argument around the need for transformation and so forth, but I think this kind of racial engineering, which we're seeing in this case, principally can be opposed. I don't think in principle that we should support this kind of racial engineering. I think, just as one last point, because I don't really have much to say, the interesting thing is to see how the public psyche in South Africa has sort of shifted, I would say, over the past few years, where I'm not sure what event has actually acted as a catalyst, whether it is the unraveling of the central government in our country, which is no longer holding, the center isn't holding anymore, or whether there are other developments. But what we've seen in recent years is this resistance to these transformative policies, not just these legal sector codes, but across many other facets of society. We're seeing resistance in for example, we're seeing resistance by Zakhele over those regulations, particularly in the aviation sector, right? Domestically and internationally. So I'm saying it's just an interesting trend to see that these transformative policies, which at least for a good 20 years or maybe more than that, were sort of accepted as necessary policies, that have some kind of moral credibility which can't be really challenged, are now increasingly coming under attack, and that makes me wonder what the future looks like, and what are the implications of that going forward. Are we going to see more resistance? Does this resistance, particularly in the legal sector, lead to more resistance across many other sectors? How does this case, which we're dealing with now, pan out, which involves these law firms that are challenging this kind of racial engineering, to say it is impractical, it is unworkable, and it is simply unfair? It will disrupt our operations. And on the other end, if you listen to people like Advocate Moses Kakane, who I saw a clip of, I think the other day, they are sort of insisting that this legal sector particularly is still very much a racially exclusionary sector that excludes Black professionals, that doesn't offer clear career progression for them. So it's just that this tension between this push for transformation and those who are saying this transformation undermines certain things is very interesting.
That's an interesting point as well, as that I think we should discuss. And Zex, maybe you might have the answer. Does the legal sector actually bottleneck the progression of Black legal practitioners? Zex, would you say, is there any evidence to show this, or is it? Yeah.
Okay, I think the issue is like so interesting to me, because the legal sector is not even opposing as you said, the transformative, agenda. Their case really is more really a technical one, and saying a technical and practical one, saying, oh no, you're using, a code that was outdated before the act was assented to and things like that, and you did not apply your mind. And as such, this is unworkable, as you've said, for the reasons that they have mentioned. But as to whether the legal sector itself, right, like I will always operate from an economic understanding, right? If you run a business and someone else is not barring you from running a competitive business, so there's a white law firm, Nicholas starts a law firm in Cape Town, and it's like, yeah, this is Woode-Smith Incorporated. And then I start another law firm next to him called Mthembu Incorporated. If Nicholas does not shoot me or bar me from starting my own law firm called Mthembu Incorporated, then there is no structural inhibitor. And this is a very important point to make, because I think the Black professionals, as represented by, in the legal sector, at least some of them, right, they want the benefits of having a long established institution and like all of the benefits that come with that experience and already an established client base, without wanting to put in the work of working within these institutions or building your own. I'm a huge proponent of, if you want to own something, just do it yourself. If you think that's, because we cannot really know, maybe there are super racist law firms out there, who are like, Black people, no way, or Indian people, no way, so maybe they are. But if those law firms aren't stopping you from practicing the law and be studying your own law firm, then like the issue is pretty much not concerning of the state. Maybe society can deal with those law firms, like, hey, maybe we won't patronize them anymore. But beyond that, like at a principle level, it is so flawed. It is a flawed understanding. This is why the transformative agenda is flawed in and of itself, because it seeks to eliminate the prospects of the people that they say that they want to uplift actually having putting in the work of building their own institutions, which, by the way, right, it would work out for everyone. You say that there are these people who don't want to work with you and they discriminate against you. Why then would you want to work within their institutions? Instead, wouldn't the best long-term solution be just building your own institution? So really, as long as that is a possibility, which it is in South Africa, then like the whole structural issue is, like, to me, a very a veiled attempt, right, like of wanting to enjoy the benefits of having, you know, or of owning a firm like Bowman's without, you know, realizing that 50 years ago or something, it did not exist. It started somewhere, and you're like, you know, we keep on delaying studying the future Mthembu Incorporated when we aren't doing exactly that. So I don't think that there is, in the sense of a structural inheritance. Are there attitudes among legal practitioners maybe that may discriminate against Black people? I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. You know, discrimination, to me, I look at it from a libertarian lens, right? If you aren't using force, you're allowed as a human being to be discriminatory because, well, you aren't hurting anyone by doing so. But also there's evidence to the contrary, right? Most as Ayanda has said, just on a personal anecdote, really, I've received, you know, great counsel about the moves I should take within the legal sector from, you know, white attorneys or white advocates who have shown no discrimination, who have actually helped me, who have explained to me from like an advocate, explaining to me the necessary steps you need to take to be able to get briefs, to be able to be successful when you are in chambers, right? And all of these things, this is knowledge that I consider invaluable to me, but I got from white advocates. But, you know, so this idea of arguing, it's a very leftist idea of saying that structures are inherently racist, which really implied says the individuals within them, I guess, are also racist. And it's like, man, the entire legal sector cannot be racist. The big law firms that are currently opposing this do have Black partners. Tembeka Ngcukaitobi was a former partner at Bowman's, right? Like, so he was a former part owner of the firm himself. So this is something that is already happening within the legal sector. I don't think it is as structural as at least as it's presented by the people wanting to pass the regulations. And then on the principal level, which is like, to me, is the most important aspect, because like the legal sector, which is why I think that case does not seem as great as it is, but they are arguing at like a technical level. So I'm like, there's a possibility that they may chow the commissioner on a technical level, they may chow their opponents on a technical level, but principally they still say that they support, you know, this entire agenda. I'm like, then you are undercutting your entire argument. Because if you support the entire agenda, you're just telling the state to rework how it seeks to implement it. You're saying that the fundamental philosophy of forcing people to give up parts of institutions that they've built, right, is okay. It's just that it does not work in this particular context that they're trying to implement in the legal sector. I'm like, then you're undercutting your case. It's only a matter of time. In 5 years time, it'll come back and it will be better. And the Biden sense, they are trying to make the state, you know, efficient in its use of force. And I think that is a fundamental problem, because principally it won't solve the issue, right? Like it won't solve the issue. If you look at Sowell has studied, you know, policies like BEE-esque policies that seek to change ownership structure from the top down across multiple jurisdictions in the world, and they never work in benefit of the group that is trying to implement them in their favor. Instead, they have the opposite effect, right? Because so if one group feels like they get no assistance from the state, it encourages that group to build more institutions, build more private institutions, and those institutions tend to grow more than state-funded ones, because the state is inherently inefficient. Can't choose winners and losers. They're like, you can't do that. There's no economy that has worked like that, and the entire principle is premised on that there will be a select few of people who will be allowed to have ownership, I guess, in these law firms, and like this will dictate an entire industry. I'm like, no, no. What you actually want in the long-term space is to have a million, thousands, hundreds of thousands of black law firms and have the entire, network. Like black people are the biggest demographic. South Africa, black people are the people who use the most legal services. So if you appeal to that demographic, you are gonna get success, right? But it is like this unwillingness to confront the inherent problem with like that is caused by this. Like if black attorneys aren't getting, clients from their own population, then the problem isn't the white attorneys or the white law firms. Then the problem is much more deeper that you have to confront at like a community level with the people who you say that you seek to represent or you want to work for. But that is a conversation that will never be had because it is an uncomfortable conversation for people to have. And as such, it is much more better to just, shift the blame to the proverbial enemy and say, yeah, they're wrong for not, in the black advocate's case, for not wanting to give me briefs. I'm like, but do you have the network? Do you have a network of attorneys? Have you built these relationships that will enable you to get these briefs? Because trust me, there are other white advocates who aren't getting briefs too, and I doubt they say that it's because of their wives, right? So it's like this fundamental not wanting to confront the actual issue that causes these things. And as I said, I always tell people that the biggest consumer market in South Africa are black people. So if you're going to say that your business isn't succeeding, then the problem isn't because it's a white business. The problem is because the black population is just not supporting it. And I think we should confront that. But as I said, I'm getting way too philosophical because to me, it was philosophical, like at its core, right? And then why I wanted the law firms to oppose transformationism, like as an ideal, because this idea of it being a constitutional project. So Martin's work is so important in this regard, right? Is that it is premised on a very shaky, understanding of our constitutional order. Transformationism or transformation as a word is mentioned nowhere in our constitution yet. Thanks to the jurisprudence, I consider it a very shaky jurisprudence of, certain judges and certain legal scholars, transformation has been considered a constitutional project and they consider it a foundational value. I'm like, but we have foundational values, we have the rule of law, we have, non-racialism, we have these values that are, set out in text. So for my legal brain, it just makes it short circuit because I'm like, it is just bad legal reasoning. If you want transformation to be a constitutional project, amend the constitution, put transformation in there, then everything has a basis in the text itself. Now it's just something that is plucked out and implied from other sections. And I'm like, but like, if the constitution wanted transformation to be a thing, it would have included transformation in there as a thing. And if you want that to be the case, then do so itself. So, the fundamental premise under which all these different regulations, to Makeba's point, that are being passed in different areas of industry, they are based on a misunderstanding, according to me, of our constitutional jurisprudence. But it has been like the constitutional court has affirmed this. So I guess we are the ones who are misunderstanding the entire thing. But yeah, either way, it's interesting. I don't think there's structural inhibition, on the part of the legal sector, because anyone can go into the legal sector. I plan on going to the legal sector and competing and hopefully getting clients, and I know that I will, because no one was just stopping me from doing so. And like that is the fundamental issue. If there is no one stopping entry into a particular market, then you cannot say that market is discriminatory in one way or the other, outside of as I said, the personal beliefs of people in white law firms or Indian law firms or Chinese law firms really should not concern you, right? Because if they aren't harming you, why are you concerned what someone else thinks of you? Especially if that person does not think highly of you. To me, it is like so counterintuitive. Like you obsess over someone who does not think highly of you. It seems weird. But yeah, I think I've spoken for quite a bit.
Some excellent points. And things got me thinking. And there's so much stuff that you've said that I spurred on thoughts in my head, but I was making sure to cling on to one so I don't just get garbled and try to say them all at the same time. And my main thing is that I think you're right that you can't say that the legal profession is discriminatory when literally anyone can go out and once they've actually graduated and they are qualified and they can go and they can start their own firm, then you can be in charge. And that's actually something we say a lot to people who say seize the means of production. You can create the means of production. but they don't want it. They just want to take. And I think that's the socialist philosophy in general. They don't want to build, they don't want to create, they want to just take what's been built by a better system, which is independent entrepreneurship. And I think a lot of lawyers want to, maybe not a lot of lawyers, because actually I was going to say, this actually goes to my main point. I don't think, my gut tells me the thrust of the support for this amendment to the legal sector doesn't come from Black lawyers. I don't think it's Black lawyers en masse saying, hey, no, we're being discriminated. We need laws that are going to give us easy ownership over these firms. And hopefully a lot of them will realize that it's not actually going to be the hardworking Black attorney who's been grafting their arse off at an associate part of Webber Wenzel who's going to be given the partnership. It's going to be an ANC appointee, because that's what always happens. Or BE ownership, it's never given to someone from the company who actually deserves it. It's always a political appointment. That's how Iqbal Survey, who's very, very Black, I say very sarcastically, is leveraged in as a BE partner in so many deals. I know a thing where someone wanted to get a radio license so they could run a radio station, and they said, you need a BE partner. He said, yeah, no, I've got a BE partner. And they said, no, we choose the partner. And there's the thing that people say, oh no, but it doesn't say that on paper. I'm like, okay, but that in practice, on paper, counselors shouldn't be going around killing each other to try for ward positions. But in practice, that's how it works. And that's what we have to, that's the reality that we have to keep in mind. But yeah, I think that the main thrust of this push is that the legal sector, even though the bulk of it's going to be private attorneys, practicing law, defending people, finding clients, signing paperwork, being notaries, all that stuff, it does form a broader part of the infrastructure that makes up the courts, makes up the independent judiciary. And BE being a way that the government can influence the ownership of the legal institutions, legal infrastructure, is a way that they can almost start capturing the judiciary through the back door. So I think that that's a little bit of the fear, is that they can use this to start influencing what lawyers are saying, what lawyers are doing, because South Africa has managed to hold off the brunt of some of the worst excesses of Afro-socialism and all the wannabe Stalinism and Leninism that the ANC, the EFF, and all that whole horde of RET factions want. We've managed to hold them off because we've got a very, very active civil society who's backed by incredibly skilled, very active, well-funded lawyers. And that is and I think the ANC finds it incredibly annoying that whenever they want to pass any law, there's a host of law firms who are constantly keeping it in deadlock, and they don't like that. So they trying to, so I think what transformation always has been, it's never really been about a sincere belief in equity or equality or even, and I won't even say it's even about racial supremacy. I don't even think it's a idea of, they want Black people to be seen as superior. I think it's always been about unlocking mechanisms in which the ANC can dominate society. It's always been about boiling the frog slowly enough that it doesn't know it's being boiled. And the frog in this case, I think you guys know that story about, I think Mario Ambrosoni had in his autobiography, while Ramaphosa was saying that the tactic that the ANC must have towards the white person is to boil the frog, and so they don't notice they've been boiled. I think the frog isn't just white people. For the frog is whole South African society, and I think the ANC, with the factions within having various levels of skill at this, are very good at trying to seize the commanding heights, seize the levers of power in a subtle way without actually ringing too many alarm bells. I think the Zuma state capture factions were quite bad at keeping it stealthy. They were being a lot more open about trying to just get in. They were kind of impatient. But I'm under no delusions. I think the Ramaphosa factions and others also want this. They want to have ultimate control. They don't want to have to deal with pesky lawyers or pesky independent judges shutting down policies that they want. I do think that there is some sincere belief behind them, but the top of their ideology is that they believe that they're the enlightened autocracy and that they need to be in charge. And I think they're very disappointed that in 1994, so in the prior to 1994, that the constitutional dispensation made us into a constitutional republic, because I think they really wanted a Soviet-style dictatorship. And I think they're still angry and frustrated about this. Ayanda, I've spoken for a lot. They've spoken for a lot. Do you have any anything you want to add? And not just about this, the BEE for the legal sector, BEE in general and transformation in general, because that's effectively what we're discussing. And I think I don't have a direct question, but I want to hear your insights.
Well, yeah, I think, as I said initially, when it comes to legal things, I'm not, you know, the expert, for lack of a better word. I think the 12 minutes that Zix had, you know, where he was explaining, I did say that he's going to provide us with a very informed opinion. So I was right, you know, very, very informed opinion from him. And I'd like to think that the white advocate he speaks of is someone I know, but I won't mention his name here. But onto the BEE thing briefly, because it will actually touch on to what we're going on. Look, and I said this to you earlier on in our little segment before the podcast started. I said, in fact, BEE became a fully fledged procurement system in 2004. I think then Begi was still president. And this would be the procurement system, which to some degree would enable later actors, if you can call it that, like the Guptas, for instance, to benefit from state contracts and tenders through ESCOM and so forth. So when I made that point earlier on to say we should understand it in that context, I was trying to say that some of these problems should not be individualized. We should look at the structures and systems that enable some of these things. Because if you're going to say procurement should not prioritize value for money and, you know, other market factors, and it should be a system that basically works around preferential procurement, which says those companies that are the most compliant with the BEE system, with the scorecard system, they should sort of have a competitive advantage in state tendering processes. You can produce these kinds of distortions that we've seen, you know, where people, for example, engage in fronting, not only fronting, but also where people deliberately inflate because there's BEE premium, so they inflate the price at which they procure goods on behalf of the state. I think all those things are more or less a result of the system itself and how it is designed, you know, as opposed to just there being bad actors. And I think the IRR has done a lot of important work with its value for money bill, which says that when it comes to state tendering processes, these are the things you should prioritize: value for money. You should try and save as much taxpayer money as possible. So I think that's the last point I want to add about BEE. That kind of system, that kind of procurement system, I think leads to a lot of distortions that we can avoid if we restructure how procurement works.
I think to add to your point, that the IRR, and I think we're quoting the same study, they said that if they eliminated BEE premiums, because BEE procurement deals, contracts, are allowed to charge more than non-BEE deals. And they did some calculation where they found that if they were to remove this premium, that we'd be able to like safely drop that to like 10 or 11%. And it would save billions on the fiscus. And it's just, BEE is one of those things where, like, you probably see on X, that's probably the thing I talk about the most because it's the one that gets the most mileage. Because I think that it is possibly one of the single most damaging pieces of legislation in the country. Now, we've got a lot of bad legislation in this country, but it's bad on a philosophical level because it goes against what you're saying, Zakes, the non-racial foundations of what's supposed to be the post-1994 democracy. It makes race an incredibly important part of regulations and doing business, which flies in the face of what we're supposed to be doing here as a Rainbow Nation. It doesn't work to stop corruption because it literally gives government a labyrinthian like library of regulations that very few people understand. I doubt these lawyers who specialize in it, who know every single aspect of it, because it's so confusing and convoluted. And when things are convoluted and Byzantine, you're able to hide stuff in there, and the government's able to say, hey, you don't have to read through all that paperwork. We don't even know what's in it. Just appoint this guy, just appoint our man. And even when someone does understand, they say, well, I don't actually care. You're appointing our man, or we're not going to give you the contract. I wish we could tell business en masse, stop doing business with the government. But the problem is that the government has, through regulation and through red tape and all this stuff, but pushing the private sector into an irrelevant space. So a lot of companies, if they want to do business, they're going to have to at least do some business with the government. Also, and I think there's even private. Then you have the supply chain where even if a company isn't doing business with the government, they might be doing business with another company that's doing business with another company that's doing business with another company that needs to do it with the state. And then that company is, well, no, I can't use you because you're using a company that's not BE compliant. And it's a sort of thing that just infects the entire economy and holds everything back, because companies don't want to register formally because they don't want to have to be held back by these regulations. It's a headache, especially for small businesses. But we're halfway through the hour, and I think it's a good time to move on to the next topic, which is also something which on the website we've had quite a few articles about.
On one more point, I'm sorry, Nicholas. On because you raised a very good point on the destructive nature of policies like BEE, right? But the entire, I think the most important point, right, to make is you get the intent, right, of a policy like BEE. Like, man, this is noble. You want to uplift people who are, downtrodden, and this was done so by legislation. And of course, intuitively, be like, yeah, let us just have also positive legislation that will seek to do the opposite on the other side. But I'm like, the fundamental problem, right, in the visions of the anointed-esque manner is that it ignores it ignores that you cannot build a functional economy like that. It cannot, in the long term, cannot function like that. Not only it will not create the results, that you cannot engineer success from the top down when the fundamental inputs that are within society are not good, right? Instead, the only way, right, you only pick winners and choosers when the market has picked them. You're like, yeah, this guy has got it because he's successful in the market organically. The best way to do this is to eliminate as many barriers as possible in the way of people who are previously downtrodden, to allow them organically to just find their way, right? Like this, it is a perpetuation, but on the other side, on a noble-esque side, I guess, of saying we'll plan your lives, right? The public government are like, we'll plan your lives and you will have nothing. And the other side is like, we will plan your lives and you will have everything. But in reality, you still have nothing. So it's like the philosophy is what is problematic. You cannot engineer the lives of so many people. It is problematic at a fundamental level. It represents a negation of the agency and dignity of these people, because you are saying inherently that they cannot succeed without, you giving them a leg up. And then when you look at the results, you're like, man, it isn't even a leg up. It is really, a perpetuation, as you say, as Nicholas, of something that infects the entire operation of the economy. And as Makeba has said, really it is like it creates these distortions, right, in the economy, because the incentives of the economy are now not market driven. In most cases they're not, but they are state driven, they're regulatory compliant driven, and that invariably leads to an inefficient economy. And then we wonder why we have the problems that we have in our economy in terms of high unemployment and things like that, beyond other regulations, right? It is like this all pervasive nature of saying we will control everything and this will function how we want it to. I'm like, that is not a way to build wealth and prosperity. It actually undermines the point that you want behind the intent of passing regulations like BE and everything like that. If you truly cared about, the entire end results of uplifting people who were previously downtrodden, then you would want to give them freedom, strong property rights, enforce their contracts, and ensure that these people are allowed to, act economically in a way that they deem fit, because trust me, they know what is best for them. Everyone knows what is best for them. But yeah, I can talk the whole day about this because philosophically, I find it so messed up.
This is actually I don't blame you for wanting to stay on this topic, because actually I want to as well, just to add, in one of the responses to one of my tweets was trying to say that the person was saying that, oh no, BE helped build the black middle class. And my response was no, it didn't. The black middle class was literally, the rise of it was literally because apartheid ended. You had the system which was artificially and brutally keeping people down, and it was suddenly removed. Of course, the black middle class was going to grow, because people, regardless of race, are smart, They work hard. They've got hustle. They want to actually succeed. They want to create a better life for themselves and their families. The only things that can stop them is government overreach, the government trying to control everything you said, or government failure to stop criminal gangs from basically acting as quasi-governments. And we have both in South Africa. We've got the totalitarian state that's also failing to fight the quasi-governments. And it is such an offensive thing, frankly, this idea that Black people need to be given this leg up. No, like, okay, literally the only thing I can think of, if I'm going to be trying to play devil's advocate, is that access to capital is hard. So if you're someone who's from a previously disadvantaged background, it's going to be, and you don't have a credit score, it's hard to borrow money to get a business grant. Okay, so but that's not, BE doesn't help that. Like just handing someone ownership of a company. Firstly, that gives we all know, we have to remind that it's not even deserving disadvantaged people being given those positions, it's political elites. But that shouldn't be the thing. What we were mentioning earlier is about people should start their own law firms. People should start their own businesses. And that's great. We should be encouraging more businesses because you want millions of businesses to be started up, because every business employs more people. They expand. A lot of businesses will fail, but the ones that survive are going to become even better and grow and expand and employ more people and pay taxes, which, good or bad, but at least in the eyes of the government, is good. And those taxes can then be just spent on things to try to, hopefully, in my view, fight those quasi-governments, but can also be used for other more important things. But if you're going to have any sort of BEE policy to try to right the wrongs of the past, what should have happened, besides the fact that, as an aside, the main wrong of the past that should have been amended is the fact that there's huge swathes of land in this country where people have inhabited and live in it and it's functionally their home, but they don't have title deeds. That should have been the first thing that was solved, but I digress. That's a topic for another episode. But the other thing that could happen is, literally, if we want to try to play a social engineering economics game, just give preferential just give business grants and have a slight preference towards people from previously disadvantaged background. Because you shouldn't be giving the money, because if you give people money, then there's less of an incentive to actually be productive with it, because if you're going to be given money and you lose it, okay, so what? So it does still need to be credit, but just give preferential interest rates. Give a preference that you'll give it. Give some startup capital. Give a leg up to entrepreneurs. But there still needs to be a business plan. There still needs to be a good idea. And as you said, Zex, the main consumer base in this country are Black people. And I think that there is a huge hunger among people of all races to want to, and especially lawyers. Like, I think that if I spoke Zulu, I'd want an attorney who can speak Zulu. I would find it, and I think that's basic. And as much as there are a lot of white people who can speak many different African languages, there's not a lot of them. And I think that there's probably a huge demand among the Black people in this country for lawyers who can speak their language. Same for therapists, but I think that's also a little bit of a cultural issue. And I will say ChatGPT has actually replaced much of the need for counselors because they're actually better. It's actually better at that job, but I won't be quoted on that. Okay, but let's move on to the next topic, because I think we could probably talk about this topic forever. But there is another one, and I know this one's also very interesting and very sad, and it's also very indicative of the state of South Africa in general. That's, of course, the resurgence of xenophobic violence in the country. And so over the past few weeks, there's been more xenophobic tension led by Operation Dudula, which I have more to say about that based on some book I read which was published a year or two ago. But something which the main context of the current protest. So there's these giant protests. They're protesting illegal immigrants, and apparently, I think 2 Nigerians were killed. 130 Nigerians have reportedly asked the Nigerian government to help them get back to Nigeria. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of stuff going through social media and the media blaming illegal immigrants for everything. We know that in the past, Operation Dudula has blocked healthcare facilities against non-citizens. I want to know, like, how were they confirming if someone's a citizen or not? Were they asking for the ID book? Because I think, South Africa has a history of asking people for some sort of pass book to see if they're allowed to use an institution, use a facility or not. So I don't think they didn't really learn from the past. Not that I think South Africans or people in general really ever do learn from the past. And I think that my main question around this is, how valid is the anti-foreigner sentiment in South Africa? And how valid is the pushback? Does Operation Dudula have a point? Or are they just a populist vigilante movement? Which, before I lose my train of thought, just to add context to this, the book I read was talking about vigilantism in South Africa, mob justice, and Operation Dudula was one of the main topics. And I was talking about in Alexander Township, how there was this big gang war between Operation Dudula and this effectively like an almost neighborhood group that didn't start out as a gang but ended up effectively becoming one. I was talking about how Operation Dudula would go to houses which they believed were being taken up, which they believed were social housing first. They didn't confirm it. A lot of houses they took were not social housing. It was privately owned. But they believed that a foreigner was residing in it at the expense of South Africa. So they would kick the person out regardless. And a lot of people are actually locals. So they weren't doing it properly. Not that they should be doing it in the first place. So Operation Dudula was going, kicking people out of their houses, and then they were renting the houses out to people and cashing the money. And then what happened was this other group called the Last Gate Boys, they opposed this because one of the people that they took was this Zimbabwean lady who had been married, who was a widow who had been married to a South African citizen. So she was a South African citizen, and she had lived there for many decades, and they kicked her out on the street. So they started opposing Operation Dudula, and it got into violence, and some people were necklaced, people were clubbed to death. The whole brutal reality of South Africa. But at the end, then the Last Gate Boys ended up taking some of the houses back, and then they held them in trust and started renting them out to people and cashing the money. And so that's a side point to that I want to discuss as well, alongside the xenophobia, is how vigilante groups in South Africa may erupt with genuine good intentions. They believe that they're trying to fulfill a gap the state is failing, either lack of border control or lack of law enforcement, but how so many of them, almost all of them, end up becoming criminals at the end of the day. And I say to close that, it's the same with the Cape gangs. I was reading history of gangs in the Cape, and so many of the gangs we know today, like the Mongrels and all that, started out in District 6 as vigilante groups, and now they're drug gangs. But Zakes, start with you. Going back to my initial question, do these anti-foreign sentiment, is that all rational?
I mean, of course, of course, rational, right? Because I'm biased on this. I
Is that
have to
rational
always
standard?
preface this. Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's a very good one, right? Because I'm like the philosopher in me, was like, no, wait. Think about this a little bit. I want to be always charitable to everyone, right? Including people who I disagree with. Like people, I am a libertarian. I want to open free borders. I want to state this so that people know that I am coming from a wholly different viewpoint that says, no, man, like anyone, if walking past a border hurts no one. So this idea that you become a criminal just by doing that is like a perversion of positivism. But I know this is an unpopular thing across even libertarians themselves, who are like, minarchists, because they still have to acknowledge some form of territorial jurisdictions. So I'm like, there's that. But I understand where, because I understand where the sentiment is coming from South Africans. I understand the frustration, right? They are seeing their communities change. They are seeing, the places that they live in change, and the people enacting that change aren't people who they think are, or at least who come from their communities, come from their clans, to speak the languages that they speak, or have the same culture as they do, right? These are people who they see as outsiders, and as such, when you see a whole lot of change happening, your local clinic, your local community, your town or your city center, And like this is frustrating. It makes you like it's a the good aspect is this is like a wholly grassroots movement. We always talk to my with Makeba about this because you know it is something that is pretty topical. And since we live in these communities, like I've seen it building like from Operation Tutula now to March and March, right? The recent marches by another organization called March and March, and like concerning even the Nigerian deaths, I don't think they happened at the protests themselves. I think the two Nigerians who died at like in police custody, if I'm not mistaken, which is concerning in and of itself because what the heck? But yeah, they did not die at the protest, thankfully enough. So, the frustrations I do get, I disagree with them, of course, right? Because I'm like, man, you have to understand something. If a foreigner moves into your community, it means that there's a property owner in your community who has decided to rent out their property to, an immigrant, whether you deem them illegal or not, right? And even the determination of like whether someone is an illegal immigrant is like something that is not done by an ordinary citizen because that is not your responsibility. But of course, we want to encourage civic duty, right, and things like that. So I'm like, I get the sentiment that like if the state is not fulfilling this duty, then why should I not? So I get that sentiment, but I'm like understanding the sentiment of saying that there are South Africans, right, who have a relationship with immigrants in one way or the other. And that is the only way that an immigrant can have a roof over their head when they come to South Africa, because they don't come carrying their house, right? So they found established structures that were built by South Africans in most cases that not. And for me, I'm like, why should, the rights of that South African? If I own property and I decide to rent my property, even exclusively, let's say hypothetically, I only rent exclusively to immigrants. Why then should as you mentioned in your regard, some vigilante group come into my house and say that why are the immigrants living here? I'm like, no, because my rights to my property, which I own, says that I can have anyone I want living in here. And who are you to tell me that? And this is a fundamental misunderstanding of something like this, because like even in the spaza shops in townships, right, they are rented out in people's properties. There's a South African landlord, most cases are not, who's collecting rental income from that. So I always try to emphasize this, that like, there are South Africans who benefit from this, and what about them? And this is I guess the sadness of democracy, because if you are a minority or a landlord, as the left would say, then man, you are in most cases that not even considered as being part of society. And this would be the case because, like, for me, looking at it from an analytical lens, I think the sentiment is not going away. Like because the sentiment comes from the communities themselves. They do this willingly themselves. Like, Operation Tutula or March and March don't spend a lot on recruiting people, on even marketing their marches, yet they always pull in like thousands and thousands of people. Like this is not going away. So analytically, I think that there will be some form of response from the state if it is smart, or some political party that will control the state in the future, because the sentiment is there, even though I disagree with it. And it's unfortunate to me because I'm like, man, I want me some good Afro-cosmopolitanism, and we have it here, and y'all are ruining things. But I get this. I get where they are coming from, right? So, and on the other side, right, on the motivations of protesters, there are things that, like, illegal immigrants or immigrants in general that are doing that are illegal, right? Like the protection gangs are growing in South African communities, and they are being utilized primarily by illegal immigrants, and in a different sense, right? Because you see these stories of like South Africans wanting to open businesses and them being intimidated using force, right? Usually, as far as the shop cartel would be owned by one particular person, and if a South African tries to open a competing business, they would be intimidated. There's like multiple evidence of this, so that is a genuine concern, which informs part of my analysis that this is not going to go away, and there's a responsibility of the state to deal with these things. Like South Africa has been flagged multiple times as being a human trafficking hotspot, and that is in large part thanks to immigrant networks that bring people, smuggle people into the country, and like employ them. Like think a place like Mozambique, you would find a young boy selling vegetables in South African townships when their peers are in schools, right? But they're pushing a trolley and selling vegetables. When you ask them their age, you would be surprised and shocked, right? You have to ask yourself, how does someone this young find themselves in a situation like this? But like these, there are networks. That's why, you know, South Africa, we are a human trafficking hotspot. We are a money laundering hotspot. Pretty much, it is a free for all, if so were. So I cannot overstate how much I get the sentiment, right? Why I understand why, you know, South Africans are responding the way that they do. The civic men, I hope the protests, at least against the state, stay as peaceful as possible, right? I'm wholly opposed to vigilante actions because, you know, well, as you said, Nicholas, once you say that the rules don't apply to me for this reason, then you are willing to make that, you know, that exception time and time again. Before you know it, you're selling drugs and saying, yeah, no, the rules don't apply to me. It's okay. I can sell drugs because, yeah, well, I can, right? And the sentiment itself, right? That is why I get to understand it. I don't consider it, right? Because, man, I've considered the libertarian position to be the most rational to your question, Nicholas. So I don't consider it to be a rational response, right? Because I'm like, and that there are fundamental problems like the earth. Liberty makes it so beautiful that we can all live in it and like have a very good time too whilst doing that. And like if there are problems, right, we should also try and solve them from a lens of liberty, because I do generally believe that no human beings love to see others suffering and all of those things, right? So, and like there is a genuine concern, and you just appeal to people in a voluntary manner, they'll be able to do that. But the response is here. The response is not going away, unfortunately. I think it will only get worse. The upcoming general elections might be like something pretty crazy, right? If parties like FNSA leverage fully. FNSA and a bit of MKP. I think MKP has sort of like an indeterminate ideology. We can't determine, but they are definitely, you know, in implicit support of such actions. In places like KZN, the movement is just fully functioning, right? And you see in places like Gauteng too, it is growing. So yeah, we only have to wait and see. It's unfortunate, as I said. I'm heavily biased. I want Afro-cosmopolitanism. I want what the Americans have in having these congregations of everyone from across the world and seeing the beautiful things that they build, right? And I'm like, man, I want everyone from across the continent to congregate here because I think that something beautiful can come out of that. But that is just my personal bias. And yeah, of course, it isn't rational. As the comment said, right? I've spoken all the points being raised against illegal immigration, from undercutting wages and things like that. These are things that like come from a place that does not understand the fundamental problem, really, of what causes these issues like unemployment and things like that. But yeah, not rational. I want open borders, but analytically, if you had to pay me and you're like, yo, what will happen in the future? Like, man, our borders will get much more tighter. The party that will be in power will most likely be a party that leveraged the anti-immigrant sentiment to its fullest and will have to deliver results to maintain the political mileage they would have gained to obtain power through that leverage. So yeah.
I think before you hop in, Ayanda, I just want to like put in something here because I think it might also inform the discussion. Is that honestly, regardless of border control policies, regardless of if we want open borders, regardless if we want closed borders, the government can't even police a neighborhood. They expect to police thousands of kilometers of border, much of which is open land, much of which is land which just which I doubt some humans have set foot on some of the pieces of land for years, if not decades. We have a massive border. We're a massive country. We have a massive border, not to mention our coastal border. And you just spoke about how we're a human trafficking hotspot. Not all that's over land. A lot of it's over sea. We've got abalone poaching. We've got the Chinese fishing vessels just docking illegally on our shores and then going out and fishing our waters. We cannot control our borders. I find it so foolish when people try to push like, oh, no, we need to close our borders, we need to secure our borders. We can't. It's impossible. There's nothing we can do about it. The best we can do is at the Mozambican border, we can put some of those things to stop cars from driving over. So those concrete tank traps. That's it. That's the best we can do. And even then, that's just one border. They will just go around and they'll go through Zimbabwe and then just drive around. So my thing is that the policy of whatever crisis of xenophobia, be it the crisis emanating from people having a knee-jerk tribalism where they just don't like someone because of something in their own life, they feel they may be unemployed, maybe they've heard about crimes. Because I will say, I was reading this book and I read about the Zamazamas who were from Lesotho and they attacked and killed those people, so brutally raped those people at that who were doing that music video. And in me, I have that knee-jerk reaction. I'm like, oh, fuck those guys. That there's this, maybe the Operation Dula has a point. I think there's a very human thing that us versus them, South African tribe versus everyone else. But at the same time, my rational side is Afro-cosmopolitanism. I do think that we would do so much better as a society if we could be this jewel of Africa that invites the brightest minds from across the continent to grow our economy, to grow our intellectual space. And I see in Europe, the countries that did the best up in the 19th century and the Russian Revolution were the countries that had a very open border policy, but they harnessed it properly. Prussia, for instance, what became Germany, was able to build this massively powerful elite army and this amazing industrial economy because they had complete open borders and they harnessed that immigration properly. They say that come to Prussia, we'll find a place where you can join the army, you can be in the industry, we want you here. I think that the problem is, if we talk about Europe, is the problem is one, that they give them a free ride. So there's no incentive to actually work hard. Like where I know in the UK, some like immigrants get higher welfare than locals. Like that's like you're getting rid, like literally the point of immigration is you want to invite labor into your country, but now you're incentivizing them not to work. And two, you need to actually have institutions that can stand up against crime. And that's regardless. You could have complete closed borders and enforce closed borders, but if your locals are committing crimes, it's not going to solve anything. So I think the problem in South Africa isn't actually a problem with foreigners. It's a problem with lack of law enforcement. Ayanda, do you agree with me on Zakes? You have the floor.
In Zulu, I would say isikhathi sidliwe inja, loosely translates to time has been eaten by the dog. So, I don't have much time left and I don't want to stay here for too long. But I think you guys have really communicated how layered this thing is. And I do want to apologize if my points are not going to be expressed coherently because this thing is messy. There's so many ideas in my mind. But I want to start here. We know for a fact that there are around 4 million South Africans, this term is very problematic, but there are 4 million South Africans who are undocumented, people from this country. So this idea that we're going to look at someone and if they have a darker skin complexion, then there's a high possibility that they're from outside the country is a bit of a problem because we know that there are people living in this country who are undocumented. So we need to be very wary of this kind of approach to verifying people's identity where we look at their skin complexion and we make decisions. And just to what Zakes said, because I think this is a very, very important point that we must move to. He mentions the term analytical. And I think this is where maybe the problem is. This is not to say that people don't have the ability, to reason analytically about things. But I think it speaks to the pitfalls of not, in this case, reasoning analytically about things, where you look at your immediate environment, you see changes, spaza shops being owned by immigrants and so forth. Maybe in some cases you see crimes being committed by immigrants. The danger with reasoning intuitively like that, looking at your immediate environment, is that you can then misattribute things, but you can also overgeneralize because you aren't looking at the bigger picture. You're basically tying this to your own immediate environment. And the danger then is when we have this public engagement between some academics, not all of them, and the people themselves on the ground, there ends up being a sense that both of us are talking past each other, because on one hand, the people are saying that these people are doing all these things in our communities and you guys are throwing all these terms of xenophobia at us and so forth. It's almost like you're dismissing our lived experiences. And what I think the academics are saying is your concerns are genuine, But because you are reasoning from your immediate environment, you are maybe misattributing the causes and you're over-generalizing. So there's a need to step back. And I agree with it. Sometimes there's a need to step back and to look at things analytically so you can see the bigger picture. I think this then fits into my next point, because I think it doesn't help us to, of course, reduce the entire thing to xenophobia. I do think there are a number of factors at play. This is not to say that xenophobia isn't at play, but it is perhaps one of the factors that is at play. Onto the MK, which Zex mentioned earlier on. They are currently going around KZN conducting these inspections at factories and workplaces where they're saying we're looking for employers who are hiring illegal foreigners, right? So that's their thing. I raise that to say that when I look at the ethnic composition of some of these organizations, it could be March and March, it could be this foundation by Upagelu Mthakathi. I think it is a foundation. It's also a very major player in these protests you're seeing now, men wearing regalia, and carrying nopkiris and spears going through Johannesburg, showing force and stuff. I raise all of that to say what some people are calling xenophobia or Afrophobia is perhaps, for lack of a better term, an external manifestation of a problem we have internally. And this goes back to what the Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni said. She was addressing a crowd somewhere a few days ago, speaking in her own mother tongue, which is Chivenda, because she's from Limpopo, right? And there were screams in the crowd saying, don't speak in that language, speak in isiZulu, and that stood out for me, and it's not the first time, we have these kinds of incidents. We've had these things before. You listen to some clips, people say things like, one tribe is at the center of this entire thing, and one tribe is going to save the country, and this rhetoric speaks to what I would call sort of a tribal hierarchy that we have in South Africa, and no one ever wants to speak about it, but I think it is there, at least in terms of perception. This idea that some ethnic groups are superior to other ethnic groups who are inferior to them, and so there is this tribal friction in the country where some groups perceive themselves as being superior than others. And then I think the external manifestation of that becomes this Afrophobia thing, where the outsiders are seen as animals, and so forth. They aren't human. They are fundamentally different to us. They don't even look like us. They're dark-skinned and so forth. But internally, that then manifests as people saying, oh, those people from Limpopo, have a darker skin complexion. So when we see them and they can't speak isiZulu or they can't pronounce a certain word in isiZulu, then we, push them around and accuse them of being foreigners as well. So my point isn't coming out clearly, but I'm saying there is this driver, at least in as far as Afrophobia is concerned, there is this driver which speaks to these internal sort of dynamics we have between ethnic groups, what you can call ethnic groups in the country. And then the last point I want to make is then on the national consciousness thing. I think Frantz Fanon spoke about it. The pitfalls of national consciousness. We know for a fact that these states that we have in Africa, which we inherited, these are colonial, colonial structures that we inherited from colonial regimes. And I think Zex made a very good point in one discussion we had the other day, where he said that they inherently come with this national consciousness, because what happened is, in some cases, you had many ethnic groups being bundled up into one state, right? And of course, if you were to take this logic of, breaking them up to its conclusion, you could end up having 30 separate states, or in some cases 40 separate states. So I think from the post-independence leaders, there was a push to say, let us try to strengthen national consciousness through a range of things, building national identity, so we avoid this fragmentation. But in doing so, then you then build this very strong national consciousness that starts to come into conflict with this greater push for continental integration, and so forth, because people feel like they're protecting their own space. So there's naturally this inherent tension between Pan-Africanism or Afro, pluralism, as you guys have called it, and nationalism, because people get a sense that we are being displaced in our own country. So I think that the second point I want to make here is that there is a strong sense of national consciousness, which then is able to unite all these other competing ethno-nationalisms, if you can call them, because Black South Africans feel like we have a great stage here with all its fair share of problems, it has good institutions, it has a relatively strong economy compared to other parts of the African continent. And now these outsiders who have destroyed their own countries in Africa are coming to destroy what we have. So that can also be sort of a mobilization thing for them to hold together. But it is a very fragile kind of nationalism, because once you think you have dealt with those guys or the enemy, then it can move into an internal thing where now it's not you saying there's a black Zimbabwean there who, should go. Now it's you saying, oh, there's a Dr. Tonga guy who should not be in our province. This is, our space where we should work and so forth. So the last point here is, I think, yes, there are valid concerns. This is grassroots level organization, and people are largely engaging the state peacefully. I think grassroots level organization in a democracy is very important. It's a healthy sign that people are engaging the state. But when, as you said earlier on, Nicholas, when these organizations get hijacked by criminals or criminal elements, but then when the other drivers of nationalism begin to manifest themselves in these ugly ways, I think it then becomes important for us to separate the wheat from the chaff, to say that yes, there are legitimate concerns, but then these other competing forces in the debate must also be attended to before we find ourselves in a situation where we don't only have violence towards people coming from other countries, but we have violence within the country. So I think that's just my views in a nutshell. I did say Mabahambe in one of our episodes when I was with Zakes, and it was just a joke. So I'm glad he never came for me on that. Yeah, but I think...
Thank you. I think very good points. And I think that my closing statement, and Zakes, you can step in after me just for your closing statements, it's just that I think that the main thrust of this us versus them, because it's not just xenophobia, as you said, is that groups in South Africa don't like other groups. That's kind of the whole history of South Africa. We had literally an entire system created because one group didn't like any of the other groups. And then we had we've had constant low level civil wars because of this thing. And I think that the main thrust, though, is that societies have an us versus them attitude that escalates into violence when there's adversity, when there's something lacking. And I think in South Africa, the main thing is there's no economic growth. So that means no jobs, no economic dignity, no income, there's malnourishment, there's all this economic desperation. And that's driving people to try to come up with reasons why they don't have they are impoverished, why they are not living as well as they would like to live. So when they see a foreigner owning a spaza shop and they are unemployed, they're going to think, hey, it's their fault that I don't have a job. And I agree. I don't think we can actually say that that's irrational. I think it's unfair of us to say that. I think that as policy advocates, what we do is that we need to look for ways that how can we get people jobs? How can we achieve economic growth? So people don't care that a Somalian on the corner owns a spaza shop, because they can open their own spaza shop, or they don't even want to open a spaza shop because because we've deregulated the health sector. Now their child has managed to actually get into a nice doctor's job because there's an artificial barrier on how many people are allowed to become doctors. That was a mouthful. And also the second thing is criminality. And I think that those are what I always like to try to return to, is that the two main issues in South Africa is that there's unemployment and that there's too much crime. And what needs to be solved is the government needs to liberalize, cut red tape, and allow people to be hired and fired with ease. And criminality is they need to actually do their damn job, which should be so they need to stop wasting time and budget and everything else and only focus on law enforcement. I honestly would, if I was in charge, I'd probably almost cut the budget to bare minimum to everything else, and they just just completely reconstruct SAPs and also make it on a provincial level. That's my closing point. Zakes.
Yeah, I think both of you have raised good points. Makeba made a very good, nice philosophical point about the motivations behind, something like this. And Nicholas, you made a good point too, behind the context that may motivate said motivations, if that makes sense. That, when people are poor and they have a whole lot of time on their hands, it's, they think of some pretty weird things to do, right? Like, it's easier to see someone else who you think is doing better than you, like, that guy sucks. Actually, all of them suck. Let's get rid of them. So, I think these are good points to make, because, as I said, it makes it easier to understand the other side, even though you vehemently disagree with them. And yeah, my final point is that, to Makeba's point, really, I think it's an important one, and that we should be wary of, the impulses behind things like these, are impulses that come from a place of a place of, I want to say, fractured identity, but a place of, say, of an identity, particularly among African people, that we have not truly really confronted and dealt with, and like come to terms with it. Because even within the national consciousness itself, right, there's still this tension within domestically in every African country, because one would be like, I'm Malawi and I'm Nigerian, and then domestically in Nigeria you have the tension between Igbo and Yoruba, Hausa people. In South Africa you also have the tension between what Makeba spoke of like Zulu speaking people and other people aren't speaking Zulu, and it manifests itself in different ways, right? And I'm like, all of this stems from an identity that I don't think African people have really confronted, cultivated. I want to say, in the Foucault sense, right? So it's like social identity, you can always cultivate it. I'm like, we haven't really come to terms with how we want to define ourselves, because in most cases are not defining ourselves. It's always in contradistinction to something other than an aspiration of something, if that makes sense. So yeah, the sentiment, I wanna emphasize this, because like I know so many. I'm a huge fan of Igbo culture, and like Igbo people are literally the ones who a lot of these people are like, no, we don't want. I'm like, man, we can learn so much from the commercial entrepreneurial culture of the Igbo people. So yeah, I am biased in this regard. I think that the South African government, right, has blood literally on its hands in various instances, but it is due to the incompetence of our state that the situation has gotten to this extent, right? Like, it is because the state has not fulfilled its duties in various aspects. To your point, Nicholas, it has not created a conducive environment for small businesses to employ as many people as is possible, and it has also not done its one duty of protecting life, liberty, and property. And these, in the culmination thereof, spill over in instances like this that I don't think are beneficial for us, because man, I'm all for Afro-cosmopolitanism. I think we should be attracting the best and brightest from Africa, and I think we will benefit from this. And the institutions that we do have, thanks to our constitution, only make that even more better, right? Like I love, so I see where South Africans who want to protect a South African culture identity come from, because I can say, screw you to my president here, but like in other African jurisdictions, you can't do that. So, there is something worth protecting. I can relatively protest even against the president himself, right, and say some very horrible things to him, and all of these things, right, that South Africans value a lot. I don't think maybe in express forms currently the protests they do, but like the sentiment of saying we should protect something that is South African, because it is, like in other parts of the continent it isn't this case. But I think it can be done in a much more better way, right? Like it can be done in a manner that does not devolve into criminality, as happens in some cases, or the use of force, but like in a way that's, for me selfishly, that will still have us being the hub of Afro-cosmopolitanism, where we are like any other place in Africa, where you'll find all of Africa in one point. And I think there's something good to that, but that is me just being emotional.
Very good points. For one, I really enjoyed this episode. I think that this could go on for many, many hours, because I think we're discussing some really deep foundational issues for South Africa in general. But unfortunately, we have to close up. I'd like to thank everyone for watching us today. And I would like to remind everyone to check out the website, rationalstandard.com, where you can see many articles written about these topics. And make sure to comment, like, subscribe, and all that. That's on YouTube and on the website for that matter, because we're on Substack. So feed those algorithms. Also, make sure to follow all of us on X and on Facebook. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next week.